Well, more on this, we're now joined via Zoom by Senior Research Fellow and Political Economist at Trade Collective Lebohang Pheko. Thanks so much indeed for joining us. It's always good to have you on the program. These are challenging times for trade unions in general, but it has been that way for a good number of years now if we just look at how their numbers have been shrinking over time.
So, I mean, what we're seeing is not only a South African phenomena, but certainly even a global phenomena in relation to trade union membership and the uptake of trade unions. And a lot of estimates, including from the ILO, suggest that the numbers of, the uptake of trade union membership has declined to perhaps by about 20%. And it's been declining exponentially over the past 20 years or so. And there are different reasons for that. I mean, the nature of work has changed. And there are lots of different professional associations that particularly new workers can align with. So rather than the traditional trade unions, particularly white-collar workers, and can associate themselves with their professional associations. So like, the nurses associations, accountants associations, and so on. And the other piece of that is that the nature of manufacturing is also changing. So work processes globally are also shifting. If you look at European countries and across the US, for example, the concerns that trade unions have there, which are very protectionist, are also to do with the influx often of migrant workers as well, also around the so-called loss of jobs to different countries, particularly Southeast Asia, and manufacturing processes being taken offshore, which has impact on their local production mechanisms, and also the sort of politics that have also played themselves out. So oftentimes over the 50s, 60s, and 70s, for example, where there were more leftist governments with which trade unions would often be aligned, the atmosphere and the environment for trade unionism found a more natural ally, although that's not always exact science either. But over the last 20 years, where there have been these strange mergers and these strange governments in across Europe, in particular, which are these coalitions of social democrats with neo-Nazis, with Christian Democrats, and all sorts of things. Even the ideological underpinning of trade union membership is changing. And lastly, that globalization and anti-capitalist sentiments are also playing themselves out, where a lot of private sector workers, private companies and corporations are fairly combative towards trade unions, fairly combative towards the idea of the very strong labor rights that many trade unions have rightly fought for the past 100 years or so. Across the African continent, we have a slightly different trajectory, which I can talk about later.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the South African story, because you mentioned politics as one of the ingredients of what's happened to trade unions over time. And when I think about the apartheid era, it seemed as if the trade unions had to be political, because a lot of the rights that were being denied were so basic that it almost needed a political type of unionization just to get basic rights. And is it that now that democracy has come, much like liberation parties struggle when they become governing parties, when they transition from liberation organization? Is that what's happened to trade unions in South Africa in particular?
Yeah, so you're quite right. I mean, South Africa and to some extent Zimbabwe have a slightly different relationship with trade unions, because, as you rightly say, they've played a particular role in our political fiber, our political landscape. And that's been over decades, right? I mean, as far back as the Durban strikes in 1973 and the first strikes in the 1930s as well. And what I think, I suppose, and South Africa is often cited as this perfect exemplar of the preeminence of trade unions. And at some stage, I think COSATU would have boasted about at least 1.7 million paid up members. It's diminished since then. But I think what's also been happening over the last few years is that within the tripartite alliance in particular, there have been a lot of ideological differences, which are quite well documented. I mean, the shift between RDP and the GEAR was one fissure. Another shift and another point of departure was HIV/AIDS policy. Another point of departure was some of the BEE, the Black economic empowerment endeavors, the earlier stages of them in the late 90s and the early 2000s, which the unions were, particularly COSATU, were very unhappy with. Another was the South Africa's posture towards the Zimbabwean regime, the Zimbabwean administration of the day under the late President Mugabe. And I think what that also points to, by the way, is the notion that I think some workers may have, that some of the major unions have somewhat neglected their role, which is primarily as the arbiter of workers' rights, and become far too politicized and far too perhaps even party politicized, rather than engaging in a socio-political ethic which looks at social cohesion and what sort of issues impact all workers. Another weakness that some people have pointed out, and that I've been observing myself in the course of my work, is that there really hasn't been much of a really meaningful conversation around how unions are able to support non-waged workers. So the definition of work has not evolved as unions have with the times. The definition of a worker as somebody who goes to a specific place 9 to 5, including online workers. There hasn't been really much of a progression in how to deal with the changing character of work, just the situation of non-waged workers or seasonal workers, for example. And then if we move to a space like, say, Zimbabwe and Zambia, where, as you're well aware, Peter, in recent years, in the last 10, 20, 30 years, both of them had important opposition movements, which essentially came out of trade union activism and trade union citizenship to some extent. Chiluba, the late President Chiluba, of course, who led I think it was MDC no, it wasn't the MDC in Zambia, and also of course the late Morgan Tsvangirai, who also led a different opposition movement, the MDC in Zimbabwe, I beg your pardon. But I do think that this also shows that there has to be a real progression in how unions relate to power once post-liberation, but also looking at different global factors about how work needs to change. The other thing I'd like to add in conclusion is that there's also a perception, which I don't think is entirely unfair at all, that unions are highly masculinized spaces, and that particularly women workers and their capacity to articulate on things like gender-based violence, sexual violence and violence against women in the workplace, sexual discrimination, and the gender wage gaps and so forth, and have not been really articulated per se as clearly by men, by unions, and by the still very masculine male leadership in trade unions. And I think globally, there's a sense in which really younger professionals and younger workers may feel that they have different options. They want to go it alone. They might not be interested in the idea of collective bargaining, because you can perhaps possibly negotiate your own performance-related bonus. Yeah. People have the opportunity to have worker-related schemes, buy into companies. It all becomes quite confusing.
Yeah, I mean, employers have become quite clever over time. I mean, they create these things called workplace forums, which take the place in many ways and become very localized for the company that they work for. And that might work for some, because an issue at a mine down the road doesn't necessarily mean you've got the same issues here, but then do all the miners work because of one mine? This is, I suppose, some of the big questions that need to be asked. But let's talk about this political story, because I mean, in the 19th century in the United Kingdom, the Labour Party was formed because there was a need for representing sort of worker class political interests. Zimbabwe and Zambia, I think, succeeded partly because the Labour unions were unified. They were right behind Morgan Tsvangirai and Frederick Chiluba. Here in South Africa, I think maybe there's some lessons to be learned, and maybe you can tell us what they might be. When we saw SAFTU break away, and then we've got COSATU in bed with the ANC, a political organization already. In other words, they're saying, we are in with you, we will vote for you no matter what. And I just wonder if South Africa can follow the Zambia and Zimbabwe route, because the unions are divided here, sadly.
So I think I almost feel that both the Zambia and Zimbabwe route were more the result of very desperate need in their perception for a shift, and that the trade unions were the most important and the most tangible mobilizing force, the single largest constellation of a groundswell, of a critical mass. And I don't think that per se it's I'm not sure whether it's comparable, because really their circumstances were slightly different. So, for example, there have been rumors in this country about a potential workers' party, and I think that a couple of parties, I think Irvin Jim and a few other, people have tried to even test this out at the ballot box, and so far it has not been successful. So I think there are a few reasons for that. The one is that the primacy of the ANC is still fairly dominant, although that's diminishing, and we'll see how that plays out in 2024. Another reason is that there's such a vibrant opposition force in this country. There are many other political formations that one can potentially choose from, that some of them that make some noise, others that are quite small but quite influential in voice, for example. And I think that is something that perhaps the trade unions in Zambia and in Zimbabwe were responding to, the vacuum, that there was literally nothing else in the political landscape. The same cannot really be said about South Africa. If nothing else, we have an overflow, an abundance of political parties. I literally don't think anybody needs to form another party. I literally think they can just go to the IEC and see whatever else there that might catch your fancy, look at a manifesto, and join forces with those to strengthen them. So the circumstances were quite different, particularly under MDC, under UNIP, under KK, our alma mater there. There was you either voted UNIP or you voted UNIP. There were no choices. So the circumstances and the genesis is quite different.
All right. So what is the future for trade unions in South Africa? I mean, it was before basic working rights, literally. But, we'd like to think that government since 1994 has done well in terms of labor legislation and that kind of thing. So much so that one would think maybe that workers are quite protected with the labor laws that are in place at the moment. So what do workers' unions do apart from fight for better wages?
There's a lot. I mean, employee protections, the notion, checking different industries' trends, ensuring that the very important gains that have been made over the last 100 years are not eroded, particularly because right now we're talking about, there are many people who are pundits who are watching developments in relation to the gig economy, for example, virtual workers who aren't who may be paid either a minimum wage or negotiate their own wages, but who are disaffiliated for the most part from trade unions. And I think that this is where many trade unions, as I said earlier, are missing it, that there's a whole new form of worker. There are different kinds of working arrangements, and some of them are very individualized. Another thing is that apart from fighting for different for different benefits and for different wages, is also to keep an eye out on the different trends. I mean, I know recently there has been new, quite useful discussions or important discussions around how different non-waged workers and waged workers from different parts of SADC need to be remunerated in relation to South African workers. And these are very uncomfortable conversations, which I think trade unions have stepped out of and instead refracted into very protectionist ways and kind of labor nationalism, which I think, given the times that we live in, is not really a forward-looking 21st century view of work. I don't think that work jobs per se have nationalities. And I do think that it's also important to think around the ways in which, for example, workers are able to then rethink and recalibrate the questions that come about through the privatization of work, the fact that, as I said earlier, a lot of corporates and your multinationals are becoming more and more combative and sometimes much less interested in hosting labor unions, making it much more, union busting is a real thing. And then I think that there's been a level of distractedness in South African unions over the last 15 years or so. At a time, 25 years ago, Peter, if one of the major trade unions, COSATU in particular, and NACTU to some extent, and NUM would have said that they're going to go on strike, the whole, the country would have stood still. I mean, all down Joburg, all down Commissioner Street, it was a standoff. Now, we haven't seen that level of mobilization over the last 10, 15 years. And I also think that there's been too much, perhaps, of pursuing party political personalities and agendas rather than the basic mundane business of dealing with workers' rights, which will always be the crucial to the economy, crucial to our manufacturing, crucial to our productivity, and crucial to the lifeblood of who runs this country and who runs any country.
All right, perhaps as a final question then, and you mentioned politics, and there are questions being raised about whether trade unions should be apolitical and remove themselves from alliances. So we hear that the EFF wants to form a trade union, and we've seen the body blows that COSATU has taken as a result of their loyalty to the ANC. What is the future for trade unions and their dipping into politics?
It's hard to tell, Peter. I don't think I can say more than that. I think it's hard to tell. And I also think that the notion of neutrality is a fallacy. I think that all unions have their own party political affiliations. There are some which are more, AZAPO, PAC aligned, like NACTU, COSATU, which has thrown its weight behind the ANC traditionally, and so forth. And there's some which are in between. And of course, there are the others which are seen as more serving the interests of disgruntled white workers, your solidarities and so forth, which sometimes have a more conservative bent. So I think the idea of neutral unions, I think is, I don't see it coming. I actually don't even see how, because on what basis do you organize? Where do you mobilize? And I think no matter how much a trade union or any formation of people, where there are 2 or 3 people at least, there will always be political affiliation, I suspect. So I think that what's more important is for there to be a number of trade unions. And I do think that what would be useful would be for the COSATU to disaffiliate from the Tripartite Alliance. But for the past 25 years, many of us have been observing this. And so far, it is a marriage that, for all intents and purposes, has managed to be sustained with all of the strain that it has caused, I think, and the tensions that it has caused. It has managed to sustain itself. And that I find quite remarkable. And how long that continues, we'll see.
Interesting times indeed. Thanks so much indeed, Lebohang. Always good to talk to you. Insights greatly appreciated as always. Good night. All right, that's political analyst Lebohang Pheko, who's a senior research fellow at the Trade Collective, talking to us about the state of the unions in South Africa. And a very unique position that we're in, given the politics and the history that's been and continues to play out in the country. So we'll have